chained in a trapper's cabin for wolves. A cowboy freed her and gave her safety. The chain was a logging chain, not the small kind you'd run through a gate latch. The kind they used to drag timber out of creek bottoms, half-inch iron links, and whoever had put it there had run it through a bolt they'd set in the floor planks and padlocked both ends to a ring around her left ankle. I know because I spent near 20 minutes working that padlock with a broken-tined fork I found in the dirt, the only tool in the whole cabin that wasn't nailed down or rotted through. I wasn't even supposed to be there. The way I came to that trapper's cabin on the north slope of the Cimarron Breaks is a story I'll get to. But I want to start with that chain, because that chain is what everything else hangs on. When you see a thing like that, a woman sitting on a dirt floor in a man's coat 2 sizes too big, her ankle gone purple and raw where the iron had been rubbing for God knows how long, and she's not crying, not screaming, just watching you work that lock with dark, still eyes like she's deciding whether you're one more thing to survive. It changes the order of what you think about. I stopped thinking about myself. That's the short version. My name is Ellis Dowd. I was 53 years old that winter, though I probably looked 60. I'd been trail riding for other men's cattle since I was 19, and there's a thing that happens to a man who does that kind of work long enough. Not the body wearing down, though, that too. It's more like the world starts seeing through you. You're part of the equipment. Nobody asks your opinion on where the herd goes. Nobody asks much of anything. You show up, you do the work, you take your pay and your bedroll and your horse and you move on to the next ranch and the next season, and somewhere in all that moving you stop expecting anything to be different. I'd been working for a man named Hargrove, running his upper pastures through the fall. Hargrove was the kind of man who owned things without knowing much about them. He owned 12,000 acres and couldn't tell you what grew in his North Creek bottom. He owned 40 head of horses and called them all by color instead of name. He owned the men who worked his land the same way, not mean about it, just careless, the way a man is careless with something he's never had to earn. Come November, he let half the crew go for winter. I was in the half that got let go. That was fair enough. What wasn't fair was the wages he'd held back for the last 6 weeks on account of some confusion about a gate I'd left open. A gate I hadn't left open. A gate I'd told him 3 separate times I hadn't left open. A gate his own nephew had left open and couldn't bring himself to admit it. But Hargrove believed what was convenient for Hargrove, and I wasn't in a position to argue hard without losing what little he did pay me. So I rode north with a thin wallet and 6 weeks of anger sitting in my chest like a coal. I had a horse, a Winchester, 2 blankets, and about 4 days of jerky and hardtack in my saddlebags. I was heading toward a town called Guthrie where I'd heard a man named Aldecoa was hiring on for a winter cattle drive down to the rail line. I didn't know Aldecoa. Didn't matter. Work was work. The storm came down from the north on the second day like it had been waiting for me specifically. That's how it felt anyway. The sky turned a color that wasn't quite green and wasn't quite gray, and the wind shifted and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in about 2 hours, and by mid-afternoon I couldn't see 20 yards in any direction for the blowing snow. My horse, whose name was Creed, was a good-minded animal, but he'd had enough. He started pulling east on his own, and I let him, because a horse that's been on the plains long enough develops a sense for shelter that a man doesn't always have. He took me to the cabin. It sat in a cutbank hollow where a dry creek bent south, cottonwoods around it on 3 sides breaking the wind, a low sod-end log structure with a door that hung crooked on rawhide hinges. No smoke from the stovepipe, no sign of anyone. I put Creed in the lean-to off the east wall where there was a little old hay, not much, and I went to push open that door. That's when I heard her. Not a word, not a cry. Just a shift of weight on the floor planks, the way a person moves when they've learned to move careful and quiet, and a soft exhale that was either fear or relief, and I couldn't tell which yet. I stood in the doorway with snow coming in around my shoulders, and I said, "I'm not going to hurt you," which is a thing I imagine every man who means harm has also said, so I understood why she didn't answer. My eyes adjusted. The cabin was dark, one small window with oiled paper instead of glass, and that gray winter light coming through it turned everything the color of old pewter. She was in the far corner, her back against the wall, legs pulled in, and that chain ran from her ankle across the floor to the bolt in the planks. I didn't move toward her. I stayed in the doorway and said, "I'm going to come in out of the cold, the storm's bad. I don't know you and you don't know me, and I don't want anything from you except to not freeze. You understand." She looked at me for a long moment. Her face was thin. She had dark hair matted at one side like she'd been sleeping on it for days. She had a bruise along her jaw that was old enough to have gone yellow at the edges. She said in a voice that was rough from disuse, "Close the door." I closed the door. I found the stove. It was a small iron box, barely bigger than a hat box, and there was wood stacked beside it. Someone had at least left wood, and I got a fire going with the flint and steel from my vest pocket. The wind hit the cabin walls in gusts, that sound like the world trying to get in, and we sat on opposite sides of that small stove, and I didn't look at her directly because I thought that might be the thing she needed most right then, for a man to not be looking at her. After a while she said, "How long has the storm been up?" "Since noon," I said, "maybe before." "You came from the south." "Southwest." She was quiet. Then, "There are 2 men who left before the storm. They went toward Guthrie for supplies. They'll come back when it breaks." I looked at her then. She met my eyes, and there was something in her face that wasn't asking for help exactly. It was more like she was giving me information and watching what I did with it. She'd been giving men information and watching what they did with it for long enough that she'd learned not to expect much. "When did they leave?" I asked. "This morning, early." "How long have you been here?" She thought about it like she'd lost exact count of days. 11 days, she said finally, maybe 12. I asked her name. She said Nora. I told her mine. I asked her how it started, not because I needed to know in order to help her, but because I thought she might need to say it. She told me in plain, spare sentences, the way a person talks when they've already cried all they're going to cry about something, and now it's just facts. She'd been traveling with her brother from Missouri, heading to meet their uncle who had a small operation near Tascosa. Her brother had fallen sick at a trading post 3 weeks back, and while she'd been nursing him through it, these 2 men, trappers, she thought, or men who called themselves trappers, had offered to take her the rest of the way while her brother recovered. She'd been wrong to trust them. She knew it now. She'd known it before they were an hour out of the trading post, but by then it was too late. I sat with what she'd told me. Outside, the storm pushed at the walls. "The chain," I said. "Where'd they put the key?" "The one named Cleet keeps it on him," she said. "But there's a padlock, old, the shackle looked thin." I went through the cabin. There wasn't much to find. A rusted skinning knife on the shelf above the stove, a pair of traps hanging from a rafter peg, some rope, a cook pot, tin cups, that fork with the broken tine in the dirt near the door. I picked up the fork, tested it in my fingers. That's when I spent 20 minutes working the padlock. It wasn't skill. I want to be honest about that. I worked the broken tine around inside the shackle slot, and I pushed and angled and tried different pressures, and I was mostly frustrated and about to give up and try to find something heavier to break the bolt out of the floor planks when the padlock clicked and the shackle popped. I think it was luck as much as anything. Or maybe the lock was just old enough that it had lost its will to hold. I got the chain off her ankle as careful as I could. The ring had been tight, and the skin under it was raw and seeping in 2 places. She didn't make a sound when I lifted the chain free, but her breathing changed. I pulled a strip from the cleanest part of the extra shirt in my saddlebag and wrapped her ankle, not tight, just to keep the cold off the broken skin. Her foot was cold when I held it, colder than the room, and I noticed that her boots were on the other side of the cabin near the door, like they'd been left there as an extra discouragement from the idea of leaving. I got her boots and set them in front of her, and she put them on herself. "We can't go anywhere tonight," I said. "Storm's too bad. Creed won't make a mile in this." "I know," she said. "In the morning, if it breaks, we go." She nodded. "If they come back before the storm breaks," I said, "you go behind me and you stay there." She looked at me for a moment. "You have a rifle." "I do." "Can you use it?" "Well enough." She nodded again, a different kind of nod this time, like she'd made a decision. I pulled the Winchester from the saddle scabbard I'd brought in with my gear, and I leaned it against the wall beside me where I could reach it without moving much. I fed the stove another piece of wood. The cabin was warming some, still cold enough to see your breath, but no longer the kind of cold that kills you while you sleep. We ate what I had hardtack and jerky, not much of it, and I gave her most of it without making a point of it. She ate like someone who'd been rationed down to nothing. When she finished, she looked at the empty cloth the jerky had been wrapped in, and then she looked at me and said, "Thank you." 2 words, but she meant them in a way that took up more space than 2 words usually do. I told her to sleep if she could, and that I'd keep watch. She curled against the wall on the side of the stove that had the most warmth coming off it, using the big coat she'd been wearing as a kind of ground cloth, and covering herself with the blanket I passed her from my roll. I sat with my back to the opposite wall and the Winchester across my knees, and I listened to the storm. She didn't sleep right away. I could tell by her breathing. After a while she said, from across the stove, "Ellis." "Yeah. Why were you coming north? You don't seem like a man without somewhere to be." It was a strange thing to say, and I thought about it. Man named Hargrove let me go. I was heading to Guthrie to find work. Hargrove, I've heard that name. He's got a big operation south of the breaks. He does. And he let you go. He did. She was quiet a moment. That doesn't say much for his judgment. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't say anything. But something in my chest moved, some old stone that had been sitting there a long time, and it didn't exactly lift, but it shifted. I kept watch most of that night. The storm peaked around what I reckoned was 2 or 3 in the morning, the wind getting truly mean, and then it began to ease, and by the time gray light started working through the oiled paper window, it had dropped to a steady, cold blow, still bitter but not the kind that kills a horse. She woke when I added wood to the stove. We didn't have any food left. I told her straight about that. She said it was fine, she'd gone longer without. I believed her, and I hated that I believed her. I saddled Creed in the gray early light, the Lenta half-drifted with snow and the horse blowing long clouds of breath. I got our gear together. I looked at the cabin in the daylight for the first time. It was meaner than I'd understood in the dark. The walls had gaps you could see sky through in places. The floor was bare dirt except for the boards near the door and the bolt hole in the middle of them where the chain still lay, and the stove had a crack in it that I don't know how hadn't burned the whole thing down. She came out of the cabin and saw me looking at it. It was colder the first 3 nights, she said. They kept the fire low. There it was again, the plain statement of a bad thing, no request attached to it. Just, here is what was. I had noticed she never asked me to feel sorry for her. I noticed it because it made me feel something without her asking me to. "We're going south," I said, "not Guthrie." She looked at me. "South takes us around the worst of the drifts and toward a settlement I know, about 8 miles. There's a woman there who runs a boarding house. She'll see to your ankle and get you fed. Then we figure out how to get word to your brother." She considered that. She said, "What about Guthrie, your job?" "Guthrie'll wait," I said, "or it won't, doesn't much matter." She kept looking at me. I got the feeling she was trying to work out what I wanted from her, and I understood why she'd be asking that question, and I also understood there wasn't a quick answer I could give that would settle it for her. The only answer was the doing of it. "Let's go," I said. She put her hand on Creed's neck before she let me help her up, like she was introducing herself to the horse. Creed lowered his head and let her do it. I took that for a good sign. 8 miles in open snow country after a storm is not a short trip. The sun came out, which sounds like a mercy but mostly means the glare off the snow is blinding. We went slow. I kept us to the tree lines where there were tree lines, moving out of the wind where the terrain allowed. Creed carried both of us without complaint. He was 15 years old and he knew his work. She sat behind me with her arms around my midsection, not clinging, just holding, and I was aware of her the way you're aware of the wind changing direction. A presence you don't look at directly, but that you're always accounting for. About 4 miles and she said, "There, southeast." I reined up. 2 riders a long way off, moving through the snow. They were coming from the direction of Guthrie. I didn't say anything. I turned Creed east along a low creek bank that dropped us below the sight line, and I pushed him into a trot. Her arms tightened some. We went east for about a 1/4 mile and then bent south again into a stand of bare cottonwoods, and I stopped us there and watched the gap in the trees where I could see the open ground to the northwest. The 2 riders came on. They were heading for the cabin. They passed it maybe 300 yards without checking in our direction. I kept us in the trees until they were well past. I could feel her breathing behind me, steady, controlled. She didn't ask me what I was doing. She'd understood it the moment she'd spotted them. When I judged it safe, I moved us south again, and I put another mile between us and that place before I let Creed drop back to a walk. She said, close to my ear, "You didn't even think twice." About what? Hiding us, getting us clear, you just did it. I thought about that. It hadn't felt like a decision exactly, more like the obvious thing, the thing the situation called for. I said so. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "Most men think out loud when they're scared, so everybody knows how much they're doing." I didn't answer that. I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or just an observation. But I noticed I'd stopped feeling invisible somewhere in the last hour. Not from anything she'd said. Just from being needed in a way that was real, not just labor. The settlement was called Hennessy's Cross, which wasn't much of a name for what it was, 8 or 10 buildings around a crossroads, a trading post, the boarding house, a smithy, a church that was also used as a school. The woman who ran the boarding house was named Adela Marsh, a widow in her 40s who'd outlasted 2 husbands and a drought and seemed unimpressed by most things but not unkind. I got Nora inside and told Adela what I needed, a clean room, hot water, something to eat, and a look at a bad ankle. Adela looked at Nora and then looked at me and didn't ask questions, which was exactly what I needed from her, and she took Nora upstairs. I put Creed in the livery and paid for his feed and came back and sat at a table in the front room of the boarding house, and Adela brought me a plate of beans and salt pork and coffee, and I ate it all. I was surprised at how hungry I was. I'd been too occupied to notice. About an hour later, Adela came downstairs and said the ankle was cleaned and wrapped properly, and Nora was sleeping, and asked me was I going to be wanting a room. I said yes. I asked about sending a message east to find a sick man by the name of the brother. Nora had told me his name was Cal Bridger, at whatever trading post was between here and Missouri. Adela said there was a freighter who ran a regular route and would be coming through in 2 days, and he was reliable. I paid for 2 rooms. I sat by the window that afternoon and watched the street. A few people moved through it, bundled against the cold. A dog trotted with purpose from the smithy to the trading post and back again. The snow on the rooftops was starting to drip in the afternoon sun, slow drops falling in a line off the eaves. I thought about the 2 riders going into that cabin and finding the chain empty on the floor, the padlock laid open beside the bolt hole, the woman gone, the fire cold. I thought about what they'd do then. Probably come into Hennessy's Cross. Probably ask questions. I sat with that for a while and decided what I was going to do about it when the time came. I also thought about Hargrove, about those 6 weeks of wages sitting in his account instead of mine. I thought about it with less heat than I'd carried it with before, which surprised me. Not because it didn't matter. It mattered. But it had gotten smaller against the size of the last 24 hours. Nora came downstairs in the early evening, wearing a dress Adela had found for her, dark blue wool, clean. Her hair was brushed. The bruise on her jaw had faded some in the warmth, or maybe the light in here was better. She walked without favoring the ankle, which told me either Adela had wrapped it right or she was too stubborn to let it show. She sat across from me at the table. "You paid for the room," she said. "I did." "And the freighter, for getting word to Cal." "Yes." She looked at her hands on the table for a moment. "I don't have money." "I know." She looked up. "I'm going to owe you." "You don't owe me anything," I said. She shook her head, not angry, more like she was correcting a wrong answer. "I don't accept charity," she said. "I'm not making a fuss about it. I'm telling you because you ought to know who you're sitting across from. I will pay you back what you spent. I don't know when, but I will." I looked at her. I said, "All right." She nodded once, satisfied. Adela brought us both supper, and we ate without talking much. Nora ate a proper meal this time, deliberate and thorough, not the eating of a desperate person, but the eating of someone refueling. I watched her out of the corner of my eye and thought, this is a woman who knows what she's worth, not in the loud way, in the quiet way that's harder to shake. I slept well that night for the first time in weeks. I didn't expect to. I'd figured the worry about those 2 trappers coming to Hennessy's Cross would keep me up, but something in me had settled. I woke before dawn, lay there listening to the building creak in the cold, and felt more like myself than I had in a long while. It's a strange thing to feel like yourself. You don't notice you've lost it until you feel it come back. The 2 trappers came the next day around noon. I'd been watching from the front window of the boarding house when I saw them ride in from the north. They didn't look like much, 2 rough men on rough horses, coats dark with travel, the kind of men you see in 100 settlements and forget an hour later. The one I figured for Cleet was heavy-set with a gray beard going yellow at the ends. The other was younger and thin, and rode with his shoulders up around his ears like he was cold all the way through his bones. They went to the trading post first. I watched them through the window. Adela came and stood beside me. She'd understood what the situation was without being told in full, the way practical women usually understand things. "You want me to get the sheriff?" she asked. "Is there one?" "Deputy Ferris. He's not much, but he's not nothing." "Get him," I said. She went out the side way. I kept watching the trading post. They came out after about 10 minutes and looked around the street. The thin one's eyes went up and down and stopped at the boarding house. I stepped back from the window, but not all the way back. I wanted to see them decide. They came toward the boarding house. I went to the bottom of the stairs and said, "Upward, Nora," quietly. She appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down. "Stay up there," I said. "Don't come down until I tell you." She looked at me for a moment, then she nodded and stepped back from the landing. I stood in the front room. The Winchester was leaning in the corner by the cold fireplace, and I moved it to the near side of the door, behind the coat rack where it wasn't the first thing you'd see, but was reachable in about half a second. Then I sat at the table with my coffee cup and waited. The door opened. Cleet came in first. He had the look of a man who thought rooms owed him something. He looked at me and I could see him take the measure of what he saw, a middle-aged cowhand sitting alone drinking coffee, nothing particular about him, and file me as negligible. "We're looking for a woman," he said. "Traveling woman, dark hair. You seen anyone like that?" "I see a lot of people pass through," I said. "She'd have come in from the north, yesterday maybe, or this morning." "What's she to you?" I asked. "Our responsibility," Cleet said. The way he said it was meant to end the question. "That's a word," I said. The thin one had come in behind Cleet and positioned himself near the door. He was watching me with more care than Cleet was, which meant he was either smarter or more nervous, and I wasn't sure which yet. "Mister," Cleet said, "I don't have patience for clever this morning." "All right," I said. I stood up slowly, the way you stand up when you're not in a hurry and you want the other man to understand you're not in a hurry. "I'll be straight with you. There's a woman in this house who says you chained her to a floor for 11 days, and there's a deputy on his way here right now who's going to be interested in that. So what I'd suggest is that you two turn around and ride back the way you came, because what's on the other side of you staying is worse than what's behind you." Cleet's face went through a few changes. The last one was the one I'd been watching for. His hands started to move toward his coat. "I already had the Winchester. I don't remember crossing to the coat rack. I remember having the rifle, the hammer cocked, the barrel leveled at Cleet's chest, and the thin one at the door had his hands up before I'd even told him to. There's something that happens in a man when the moment is real, when there's no thinking to it, just the thing that needs doing coming up through you like it was always there waiting. I'd had moments like that before, not many. "Hands where I can see them," I said to Cleet specifically. "Both of you." Cleet put his hands up. His eyes had gone flat and careful. "There's the door," I said. "Walk to it slow." They walked to it slow. The thin one went through first and Cleet went through after, and I moved them through with the Winchester until they were on the street. And that's when Deputy Ferris came around the corner from the far end of the building, Adela Marsh just behind him. Ferris was a young man, maybe 25, and he had a face that looked like it was still deciding what shape it wanted to settle into. But he had his hand on his revolver and he was walking straight at us, which was enough. I gave him the short version. He looked at me, looked at Cleet, and the thin one looked at the rifle in my hands. "I'll take them," he said. He said it like he meant it. He took them. I stood in the street after they were walked away, and the cold came down around me, and I noticed my hands were steady. I'd been aware during the whole thing that I was 53 years old and outweighed by both of them, and that the Winchester was the only thing that had made the odds even, and I'd kept that in mind the whole time. I've learned that knowing your situation clearly is not the same as fear. It's just useful. I turned around. Nora was standing in the boarding house doorway. I don't know how long she'd been there. Long enough. She had her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and she was looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Not relief exactly, not gratitude exactly, something past both of those. Like she was seeing something she'd been waiting to see for a long time without knowing she was waiting. She said, "You told me to stay upstairs." "I did," I said. I was on the stairs, she said. I could hear. I figured, I said. She came down the porch steps and walked up to me in the street, still with that expression. And she put her hand on my chest, flat against it, the way you'd press your hand against a wall to see if it's solid. She said, Ellis Dowd, you didn't have to come back from that window. You could have put us both upstairs and waited for Ferris. Could have, I said. But you didn't. No. She looked at me for a long moment. Her hand was still on my chest. The street was empty and the snow was dripping off the eaves. I want to tell you something, she said. I waited. I have known some men in my life who were strong in the way that's really just taking up space. And I have known one or two who were actually strong, and you can feel the difference. What you feel now, she pressed her hand a little more firmly into my coat, is the second kind, and that's a rare thing, and I think you probably don't know it about yourself, or you've been around the wrong people long enough to have forgotten it. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I stood there in the cold street with her hand over my heart, and I let that settle into me because it needed to. After a moment I said, your brother's going to want to know you're safe. She smiled just a little. He will, she said. He's going to want to know who brought me in, too. I'll write the message myself if you want, I said. I can find the words. I know you can, she said. She took her hand off my chest, but she didn't step back. We stood there together in the cold and the dripping eaves and the long, pale light of a winter afternoon, and I thought about Hargrove and his 6 weeks of wages, and I found I was almost grateful for it. Not for the man, not for what he'd done, but for the road north it had sent me down in a storm, for the horse that found shelter, for the door that swung open on a dirt floor, and a woman who was deciding whether I was one more thing to endure. That night Adela fed us again, the whole boarding house, 4 guests and herself and Nora and me at a long table. And afterward we sat by the fire in the front room, and Nora told me about Missouri, about her brother Cal, about the uncle in Tascosa they were trying to reach, about a farm she'd grown up on that back to a river she said was the color of old iron in spring. She asked me about the ranches I'd worked. I told her some of it. Not all. There was a long stretch in the middle of my life that I didn't tell her about that night, things that take longer to say than one evening beside a fire. But she listened to what I gave her the way you listen when you're actually interested, not just waiting for your turn. At some point I realized I'd been talking for a while, and I stopped. She said, don't stop. I was rambling, I said. You weren't, she said. I thought about that. I tried to remember the last time anyone had said that to me. Don't stop. Keep talking. I'm listening. I couldn't remember. The fire had burned low. The other guests had gone to bed. Adela was moving quietly somewhere in the back of the house. Outside the wind had dropped off, and it was the deep, still cold that comes after a storm has fully passed, when the sky goes clear and hard and the stars burn bright with nothing between you and them. What are you going to do? Nora asked. Once Cal gets here and we're sorted. Find work, I said, same as always. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, the uncle in Tascosa, his name's Grover Bridger. He has 200 acres and 3 horses, and he's been trying to run it with just himself since his wife passed. He wrote Cal saying he could use a man who knew cattle. I looked at her. I'm not saying, she said carefully. I'm telling you what I know, the same way you told me about that settlement in the south before we rode toward it, just information. I sat with that for a while. Tascosa, I said. South of the breaks, she said. Spring country comes back early, not like up here. I thought about Aldecoa and Guthrie, and the winter drive to the rail line, and the pattern of a man moving from job to job and season to season and never landing. I thought about what it would be like to land somewhere, to know the name of every horse. Your uncle's a fair man, I asked. He is, she said. Not like Hargrove. Not remotely like Hargrove, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, the way she'd stored the name from our conversation miles back and pulled it up now without effort, like she'd been carrying my story along with her, that hit me in some place I hadn't expected. She was looking at me with those dark, still eyes I'd first seen in the lampless cabin, the ones that had been deciding whether I was one more thing to survive. They decided something different now. I could see it. And there's a thing that happens to a man who has spent a long time being seen through, being part of the equipment, when a woman with her own strength and her own clear judgment looks at him and finds him worth looking at. It doesn't roar. It doesn't announce itself. It comes in quiet, like morning light coming up on good country, and you realize it's already there. The fire popped. A log shifted and sent a small column of sparks up the flue. "I'll think on Tascosa," I said. "That's all I asked," she said. But we both knew what I meant, and she let me mean it at my own pace, which was another thing I filed away about her. She didn't push. She stated and she waited, and she let a man come to a thing in his own time. I hadn't known that was something I needed until she gave it to me. In the morning, the freighter came through, a day early on account of wanting to beat the next weather coming. I wrote the letter to Cal Bridger myself, as I'd said I would. I told him his sister was safe, that she was in good health and good hands, and that when he was well enough to travel, he should come to Hennessy's Cross and ask for the Marsh boarding house. I didn't tell him the rest of it, what she'd been through, what we'd come through, because that was hers to tell when she was ready. Nora read it before I sealed it. She read it with her head bent, and when she looked up, she said, "You said good hands." "I did," I said. "Yours," she said. "Mine," I said. She folded the letter and handed it back to me, and I sealed it and gave it to the freighter. We watched him go. Deputy Ferris came around that afternoon to say that Cleet and the thin one, whose name turned out to be Voss, were being held, and that a man from the county seat was coming to deal with them formally. He told me I'd likely need to give a statement. I said that was fine. He shook my hand with more firmness than I'd expected from a young deputy on his first real case, and then he looked at Nora and touched the brim of his hat and left. 2 days passed. Cal Bridger arrived on the 3rd, pale and thinner than Nora expected, but upright on his horse, which she said meant he was all right. He was a few years younger than her, lean and sandy-haired, with steady eyes that went to his sister first, and then to me with a look that said he was working out what I was to her. I let him work it out. He shook my hand at the end of the first evening, after Nora had told him some of it, and he held the shake a beat longer than a regular handshake. He said, "I owe you." "You don't," I said. He shook his head. "Man does a thing like this, he's owed." "Then consider the debt paid already," I said. "Just get her to Tascosa safe." He looked at me sideways. "She told you about Tascosa." "She mentioned it." He nodded slowly like something was making sense to him. "Uncle Grover'd be glad to have you," he said. "Man who can do what you did is a man worth having around." I thought about that phrase, a man worth having around. I'd been replaceable labor for 30 years. A man worth having around was a different thing. "I'll ride down with you," I said. "If you'll have the company." Nora was across the room talking to Adela, and she either didn't hear that or she heard it and decided to go on talking, which was the same thing. We left the next morning, the 3 of us, south and west under a sky that had gone the hard, clean blue that comes after a real winter storm has scrubbed everything clear. The plains spread out wide and pale, and the cottonwoods along the creek bottom stood dark against the snow, and Creed moved under me with the good loose stride of a horse that knows it's going somewhere rather than just away. Nora rode her brother's spare horse, a bay mare she'd named by the 2nd mile. She rode ahead of us some because the trail was narrow and because she knew where she was going as well as any of us. I watched her ride. There's a thing a good woman does when she moves through the world. She moves like she belongs in it, not loud about it, not performing it, just present in it. And there's a man who notices that, who has spent so long being overlooked that he's learned to recognize the real thing when he sees it because he's been given so much that wasn't. We made good miles that day. At noon, we stopped beside a creek to water the horses, and Cal made coffee on a small fire, and we stood around it with our tin cups and said very little because we didn't need to. Nora came and stood beside me, not in front of me, not leaning on me, beside, the way you stand with someone when you're the same kind of thing and you know it. "Cold'll break soon," she said. "Week or 2, I said. "Tascosa's pretty in spring," she said. "Uncle Grover's place backs to the Canadian. River comes up fast when the snow melts." I looked at the creek, moving black and quiet under the ice at its edges. "Iron color?" I asked. She turned and looked at me, and she was smiling, because she understood what I was saying, that I'd been listening to her, that I'd carried what she'd told me. "Iron color," she said. I nodded. I looked back at the creek. Beside me was a good woman, free and willing, who had looked at a worn-down cowhand in a trapper's door and decided he was worth trusting. And on the other side of a week's ride was a piece of ground in spring country, and a man who needed help with cattle, and a life that might look something like settling instead of drifting. I didn't say any of that. I drank my coffee. But Creed was fed and rested and willing. The sky was clear all the way to where it touched the earth, and ahead of us the trail ran south. That was enough, that was plenty.